For centuries, Russian leaders have pursued expansion, power, and glory through war, often with no regard for the lives of the common people. Time and again, Russia has launched wars that served no purpose for the people, but satisfied the vanity, ambition, and paranoia of those in power. The Russian soldier, usually a conscripted peasant, was sent to die in far-off lands in brutal winters, and for causes that had nothing to do with defending their homeland. From Ivan the Terrible to Vladimir Putin, Russian rulers have made their people suffer and die in wars they never asked for and gained nothing from. This is a long history of senseless death, where the Russian people were used as cannon fodder for wars that offered them only misery. While we can count several wars before this, we will begin with the Livonian War, as it was initiated by the first Tsar of Russia, marking the beginning of the still ongoing brutal era of Russian imperial ambition. The Livonian War was a war of conquest initiated by Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar. Obsessed with expanding Russian influence into the Baltic Sea, Ivan launched a 25-year-long campaign against Livonia, which is modern-day Latvia and Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Ivan's ambition quickly turned into a disaster for Russia. His soldiers, many of them peasants forced into military service, were sent into freezing battles with inadequate supplies and outdated weapons. Russian towns and villages were razed, and entire regions were depopulated by the war. The Russian people, already suffering under Ivan's brutal rule, now faced famine, disease, and constant invasions from their enemies. Ivan's paranoia worsened, and he executed many of his own generals, leaving the army leaderless. The war ended in failure for Russia, with no territorial gains, while tens of thousands of Russian soldiers died for nothing. The common people returned home to continued serfdom and oppression with nothing to show for their suffering. After the death of Tsar Fyodor I, Russia entered a period of chaos known as the Time of Troubles, where political instability and foreign invasions ravaged the land. Russia became a battleground for dynastic claimants to the throne, and both Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden took advantage of the internal turmoil to invade Russian territory. The Russian people suffered enormously during this period, caught between warring factions and foreign armies. Russian soldiers, forced to fight in battles that had little to do with national defense, died by the thousands in battles against the Polish and Swedish invaders. Meanwhile, famine swept through the land, killing millions of civilians. Entire cities were sacked, and the Russian countryside was left in ruins. The common people gained nothing from the endless wars fought to install or protect various czars. They were left broken, starving, and dying in a country that offered them no hope. By the mid-19th century, Tsar Nicholas I sought to expand Russian influence over the weakening Ottoman Empire, leading to the Crimean War. Nicholas, living in luxury in St. Petersburg, sent his soldiers to die in the trenches of Crimea for a conflict that had nothing to do with defending Russia's homeland. The war quickly became a disaster. Russian soldiers, poorly equipped and with no modern weapons, were forced into suicidal charges against British, French and Ottoman forces. The siege of Sevastopol was particularly brutal, where Russian soldiers died by the thousands, not just from enemy fire, but from disease, malnutrition and exposure. Typhus and cholera tore through the Russian ranks, and the dead piled up in the trenches, their bodies left to rot. Nicholas gained nothing from this war. Russia was humiliated on the international stage, and hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and civilians had died for nothing. The common people returned to their serfdom, having gained no land, no freedom, and no relief from the oppression of the Tsar. In 1904, Tsar Nicholas II, desperate to expand Russia's empire into East Asia, initiated a war against Japan that would become one of the most humiliating defeats in Russian history. Nicholas, living in luxury while his people starved, believed the Russian military could easily crush the Japanese. Instead, the poorly equipped and poorly led Russian forces were annihilated. At the Battle of Mukden, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers died in freezing conditions, their bodies left to rot on the battlefield. The Russian Navy faced an even more humiliating defeat at the Battle of Tsushima, where over 4,000 sailors were killed and most of the fleet was destroyed in a single day. For the soldiers and sailors who survived, there was nothing to return to, only a broken empire and a country on the verge of revolution. The Russian people, many of whom had been conscripted into this pointless war, gained nothing but death and misery. Nicholas II's arrogance led to the deaths of tens of thousands of his own people for no reason, and the war's failure hastened the collapse of the Russian Empire. In 1939, Stalin, obsessed with expanding Soviet borders, launched an unprovoked invasion of Finland. The Winter War was an exercise in senseless death, as Stalin sent wave after wave of poorly equipped Soviet troops into the freezing forests of Finland. Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripted peasants, were sent into battle without proper winter gear, freezing to death in sub-zero temperatures. Finnish snipers and guerrilla fighters decimated the Red Army, which had already been weakened by Stalin's purges of military leadership. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 150,000 soldiers in the conflict, many from frostbite and starvation rather than enemy fire. The survivors returned home traumatized. But for what? Stalin gained only a small strip of territory, and the people of Russia gained nothing but the knowledge that their lives were utterly disposable in the eyes of their leader. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Lenin, eager to spread communism across Europe, launched an invasion of Poland. The Polish-Soviet War was a deadly gamble, driven by ideology and imperial ambition rather than any real threat to Russia. Soviet soldiers, many of them ill-trained and conscripted peasants, were thrown into a campaign far from home in a country they had no reason to fight. The Battle of Warsaw was a catastrophic defeat for the Red Army, which suffered over 50,000 casualties. For the common Russian soldier, the war was a nightmare, fought for an abstract political ideology that brought no benefit to their lives. The war ended in failure, and the Soviet Union was forced to sign the Treaty of Riga, losing territory and prestige. The Russian people gained nothing from Lenin's ideological ambitions, only more death, famine and repression. In 1956, the people of Hungary rose up against Soviet control, demanding freedom and reform. But Nikita Khrushchev, determined to maintain the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe, ordered a brutal invasion of Hungary. Soviet soldiers were sent into Budapest to crush the revolution, firing on civilians and reducing parts of the city to rubble. Thousands of Hungarian civilians were killed, and Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts, were forced to become the enforcers of tyranny. The Russian soldiers who died in Hungary did not die defending their homeland. They died suppressing the freedom of others. The survivors returned home with blood on their hands, but the Russian people gained nothing. The Hungarian people remained oppressed, and the Soviet Union continued to be seen as a brutal occupying force. In 1968, the Prague Spring offered hope for reform in Czechoslovakia, but Leonid Brezhnev crushed that hope with overwhelming military force. Over 200,000 Soviet troops, alongside other Warsaw Pact forces, invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the reform movement. Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripts, were ordered to suppress peaceful protests and enforce Soviet domination. The common Russian soldier was once again used as a tool of oppression, sent into a foreign land to crush the aspirations of another people. Hundreds of Czech civilians were killed, and Soviet soldiers returned home with nothing but the shame of having participated in a senseless invasion. The Russian people gained nothing from this war, only more international condemnation and continued oppression at home. In 1979, the Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev, launched an invasion of Afghanistan in an attempt to prop up a communist regime. The war quickly became a quagmire, with Soviet soldiers dying in droves in the mountainous terrain. Young conscripts, many of them teenagers, were sent into battle without proper training or equipment, facing brutal guerrilla warfare from the Afghan Mujahideen. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, costing the lives of over 15,000 Soviet soldiers and leaving tens of thousands more wounded or traumatized. The Russian people gained nothing from this war, only the loss of a generation of young men. The Soviet Union eventually withdrew in disgrace, having achieved nothing but the devastation of Afghanistan and the destruction of countless Russian lives. In 2022, Vladimir Putin launched an invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, in a bid to reassert Russian influence over its neighbor. This war, like so many before it, served no purpose for the Russian people. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, many of them conscripts, have already died in Ukraine, facing fierce resistance from Ukrainian forces. Russian soldiers, poorly trained and equipped, have been sent to die in bombed-out cities and freezing trenches. Their bodies return home in secrecy, hidden from the Russian public to maintain the illusion of Putin's strength. The common people of Russia gain nothing from this war, only more death, economic hardship, and international isolation. Meanwhile, Putin continues to live in luxury, secure in his power, untouched by the devastation he has caused. From the Livonian War to the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has repeatedly dragged its people into unnecessary wars, sacrificing millions of lives for the ambitions of its rulers. The common people, soldiers, peasants and workers, have suffered and died in foreign lands, in freezing conditions and for causes they did not understand. They returned home to the same oppression, poverty and misery that had driven them to war in the first place. This is the legacy of Russia's senseless wars, centuries of death and suffering with no end in sight. Please like and subscribe to Valor and Vice.